Hello everybody, thank you for joining us for today's video. Following up with what we've been talking about this week, we're going to keep talking about OCD and maybe in a somewhat unstructured fashion talk about whether or not certain behaviors are or are not OCD that are probably common behaviors. I don't know. I feel like I don't have a ton of compulsive behaviors personally. Maybe impulse control issues, but not compulsive behaviors. So like, I don't know. What do you guys think are the kind of these common ones that people say, oh, I'm OCD about this thing?
Right. Well, I think one of the reasons we wanted to film this is because we hear that so often. People just throw that out like, oh, I'm so OCD, or oh, they're so OCD. And I think people get really confused about what actually OCD is and what meets criteria for OCD. Right?
But why is that important?
Well, for one thing, I think it can be really detrimental to people who actually have OCD when we just throw it around like, oh yeah, I have OCD because I just washed my hands 3 times after I cracked an egg, right? That doesn't necessarily qualify for being somebody who struggles with this. And so I think it really is harmful to people who do struggle with OCD because we kind of make light of it and make it seem like it's something that it isn't.
Sure. And I think it confuses people, right? Like, you might give yourself symptoms that didn't exist, right? We've been like, oh, am I OCD? Maybe I'm OCD because I'm doing this thing. Like when you're talking about cracking eggs, I think of anytime I cook food, I do that thing. Like every time I touch food, I go do this in the sink with my fingers.
Dude, I do the same thing last night.
But I don't. It doesn't. In my mind, I'm like that's not a obsession or compulsion. Like I'm not thinking anything. But I could see how someone doing that could be like, oh, I'm so OCD about food on my hands or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Right. One of the other things that I guess, and I don't know, this is like my own soapbox I get on sometimes, right? But people will say, oh, I'm OCD or I'm so OCD. Like, no, even if you struggle with obsessive compulsive disorder, you are not the disorder, right?
Sure,
and so,
just the language of it.
Like so much of and I know some of those things sound so picky, but even just the language of it can cause us to feel a certain way about ourselves if that's something that we struggle with, and can just cause a lot of bad information to be out there for people. So I think it's just an important thing for us to understand better.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That's why I wanted to ask the question, because I have some of those same thoughts, and I think it's important, but sometimes I worry that I blow things out of proportion. So I thought I'd throw it back to you guys.
No, I think it's valid for any kind of mental illness because we don't do the same thing if you have cancer. Not like, oh yeah, you're cancer.
Right.
That's something you have. It's something you're dealing with, right? It's not your identity.
Right. And when your identity starts to get so tied up in a mental health disorder, it causes all kinds of other problems, right? It becomes so much more difficult to treat. So I just think some of the language that's out there about this, people don't really stop and think through what that actually does to people who are struggling with something like OCD, because this can be something that can get pretty severe for people. Yeah.
I think that kind of leads into a good question. So when we talk about a disordered behavior, where's that line? When does something become I'm just rinsing my fingers in the sink every time I touch something to a actual disorder?
You want me to answer that?
Yeah, I do.
So one of the things that I talked about in another video was I think there's really a couple of key components for OCD. Number one, it has to be an obsessive thought. You have to be careful because anxiety can have obsessive thoughts. OCD is an anxiety disorder. So the umbrella is anxiety, OCD is one of those. But you have to have obsessive thoughts, but then you have to have a compulsive behavior with the hope that it will provide relief from whatever the thought, urge, or image is, right? So that's the clinical definition of OCD. And then the second thing would be there's a certain amount of this is always hard to evaluate, but in our world, the DSM talks about, it always has a line in there that it has to cause some type of significant distress or impairment, right? Mm-hmm. So is going to the sink and rinsing off your hands after you crack the egg or the raw chicken, is it causing significant distress or impairment?
No.
Probably not, right? And so it's hard to kind of measure that, but one of the lines that they throw out there is that sometimes these behaviors can take up to an hour out of your day doing these things. That's when it becomes diagnosable level. One that we hear a lot is if you're washing your hands to the point of bleeding, constantly, right? So it really does get in the way. Maybe you're getting written up at your job because you're late at work because you have to
Lock your door 17 times. Yeah.
So once it starts to affect social life, occupational functioning, things like that, that's when it actually starts to meet criteria.
Right, because if we're being honest, all of us have thoughts, all of us have worries, and all of us do things to try to make the anxiety about those thoughts less, right? And that doesn't necessarily meet any kind of criteria for anything except for being human.
Sure.
It really has to cross the line to this point where it's causing significant distress in your life.
For sure.
It's getting in the way. It's making you feel pretty terrible, right? It can't just be that you feel like you need to rinse your hands a couple of times. And I guess like this is the other thing. Sometimes people think that OCD only looks like washing your hands or putting things in straight lines, right? And that's also just not true. I mean, these obsessive thoughts can take on so many different shapes and forms.
I feel like one that I'm seeing more recently too. So there's 4 criteria that I talked about in another video, or 4 areas of OCD: contamination, safety. Man, I can't remember. I'd have to go back and look at it. But one of them that I'm seeing more often tends to be like this appropriateness or this worthiness piece. And I'm actually seeing a lot more increase in unwanted aggressive thoughts, sexual thoughts. And so those things can become very debilitating for people.
Like you have a thought, you can't figure out why you have it, you feel terrible for having it, you're trying to like talk yourself through it and make sure you still feel like a good person because you're having that thought, right? Even though that necessarily doesn't have a compulsive behavior, it does have something you're sitting and doing in your mind to try to make yourself feel better, right?
Yeah, so this is my frustration with OCD, is that there can be a mental compulsion.
Sure. Then it's all purely in your head.
Yeah, and that's very hard for me because I'm a behaviorist by nature, but
Okay, Josh, let's play OCD or not.
let's pick on Jaden.
No, let's pick on Josh.
I wish I could, but I don't know if I really have that many examples. I was such a disorganized life.
No, you
that-
can use me as examples, but
Yeah.
you have to decide if it's OCD
We'll bring
or
up
not.
Oh,
only
okay.
Josh-related
Yeah,
behaviors.
let's do
right?
it.
Okay, so tell us again how you mow your lawn.
Diagonal lines. I like the line, and I alternate so that there's not always the same consistent pattern of diagonal in the lawn.
OCD or not?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yes.
Okay, so let me clarify the criteria.
Right.
Right.
Is it causing you significant distress?
Yeah, the answer is no. And
How
part
does
of that,
it make you feel knowing that I mow my lawn in a circle and get closer to the middle?
I think that's a very unique and interesting way of doing it. I think that's how most people probably do it.
I just don't like having to go to the edge and turn it around.
But see, here's, I think, the other piece to that. I could, and I have, and sometimes do, mow parallel or perpendicular, but not in a diagonal fashion. And I'm fine. It doesn't cause me, I can change my pattern and it's okay, which I think is a big clarifier for OCD.
Yeah.
So
Right.
no, mowing my lawn is not OCD.
Correct. Not
Correct.
OCD. Right?
Like a little
Not OCD
buzzer or ding
because
sound.
yeah, because really this doesn't cause significant distress in your life. You're mowing your lawn anyway. You happen to be particular about how you would like things, but on the other hand, if you had to do it another way, it would be okay. And I don't really know that it's necessary to do it another way. I think that's completely reasonable, right?
Sure.
At what point would this cross the line?
So this was interesting. I learned a new word when talking about mowing the lawn yesterday in our fun lunch. Somebody brought up the idea when you're mowing your lawn in straight lines that sometimes you veer off and you leave mohawks.
Oh, like when you miss a spot on grass.
And I'd never heard it called a mohawk, but I noticed I was rushing to get through mine 2 nights ago, and I have a couple of mohawk spots. It becomes a problem if I'm out there searching for these mohawks and then using the lawn scissors to trim them
Make sure
down.
it's even.
I still have mohawks, by the way.
If this started to cause you significant emotional distress because of it, or if it started to take an unnecessary amount of time and energy out
Right.
of your life, out of other things, then that would be considered something that was obsessive compulsive.
For sure.
Right.
But it's totally something that someone could do and be like, oh yeah, I'm OCD about my lawn.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they
Right.
might say that, right?
Yeah.
But it's not actually OCD.
Right.
It's just being particular.
It's
Yeah.
not clinical, right?
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Wait, I've got one.
Oh, yeah, let's hear.
I don't color coordinate my clothes, but my wife does, and if she sees my closet, she will color coordinate my clothes.
Oh, really?
Because she likes to color coordinate her clothes.
Mm-hmm.
But I have a hard time maintaining that.
Do you really?
Probably just out of laziness, yeah.
See, that stresses me out because I color coordinate.
Okay. I didn't know it was a thing until I got married, but the more people I talk to, I realize a lot of people do that with their clothes.
That's so funny.
Do you?
Uh-uh.
No?
No. Okay, so OCD or not?
This is mine. You guys tell me. I guess it'd be my wife's OCD.
I was going to say, I can't speak to her, right?
Right. So I would say, like, I don't see anything about this that I would consider to be obsessive compulsive unless, again, like it caused her significant distress or if it was taking a big amount of time out of her day, right? It's interrupting her life.
I think I cause her a significant amount of distress because I won't listen and just do it. But I don't think that the fact that she sometimes opens my closet and sees they're not coordinated bothers her, and she doesn't feel the need to always fix it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
But that's another one, right? Like it could be, oh, she's just OCD about my clothes in the closet.
Right.
Not really, but some people just like diagonal stripes in their lawn, right?
Yeah.
There's something satisfying to people about the way they do things, I guess.
Right.
Okay, so what about this one? Locking your doors at night and going to bed, but not being able to shut off the light at the same time that you lock up for the night.
So, like, you got to lock up first, and then you got to come back later and turn off the light?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It seems like an extra step, but again, it always comes back to like how distressing is it, and how is it taking you 30 seconds longer, or is it taking you an hour longer because you have to go through and check all the locks again before you go turn off the light or something?
Right. This one kind of rides that line for me because I think this could definitely start to look like obsessive compulsive behavior. Because if we look at it, well, why not? Why can't you? Right? What are the associated thoughts and beliefs that exist there? This, for me, would be sort of like an entry-level OCD thought or behavior, right? Because I don't know that it's going to stay in that exact same position. So, right, is that how it's going to stay for the rest of your life? Is just like you lock your doors and windows and then you get in bed and you got to get up later and turn off the light and that's where it stays? Or does this end up being that you have to do multiple things to start helping yourself feel safe at night, right? I don't know that this is something that would just stay in place like that.
Right. Is this the first step down a more
road.
serious path, or is it just the way it is?
Right.
So what if, providing more of the information to the picture, what if it was a worry about safety concerns?
Yeah, and so I would say, well, why can't you turn off the light and lock the doors at the same time?
Because people might recognize that I am asleep, and then they could take advantage of something to do with my house, whether it's going into my garage and stealing my tools or breaking into the house. I have kids, that kind of thing.
Yes, and I would say that this is probably pretty mild, but I would say that meets criteria.
And then if I told you it happened, I got out of bed 10 or 15 times before I could fall asleep.
No longer so mild.
Yeah.
So I share this one because this is actually a case I worked with in the past. Was exactly that. There was a safety concern, and I couldn't lock the doors and go to bed at the same time I turned off the lights because I didn't want people driving around at midnight that thought everybody was asleep. And
So they would lock all the doors and then get up at midnight to turn the light off.
They would lock the doors and go hang out for a little while and then turn the light off and go hang out for a while. And then they'd go around and recheck doors and windows. But again, to the point of they were up till midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
So there's that time piece, right?
Yeah.
So this would be a diagnosable OCD condition.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I kind of feel like, kind of thinking of what you said about like this, this is like maybe the first step and you need to be worried about walking down that path. I kind of think of it like, I think I told you this earlier, like it's almost like superstitions, right? It starts out as like, well, obviously I don't think if I step on the crack, my mom's back is going to break. But just in case, I'm not going to do it, right? Like,
For sure.
I feel like as a little kid, we probably all had that thought. You're like, I feel like this first step kind of starts out that same way. It's like, well, I mean, no one's probably going to break into my house. I know I locked my doors, but it doesn't hurt to check them again.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of that same, like, I think it's easy to justify when you're like, well, why not? The reward outweighs the risk of doing the behavior. But then
Right.
before you know it, you're checking your doors 15 times.
Right. I would say that this is one of those things that we talk about when we talk about any kind of anxiety treatment, right? When you have some kind of anxiety and you try to do something immediately to get rid of the anxiety in the short term, it's going to make your long-term problem worse. Because with anxiety, we have to learn how to sit with it for a period of time. And this, I think, just is one of those things that goes down that same line. We have to learn that sometimes it's okay to have anxiety, and it's okay just to sit with it and notice it and recognize that just sitting with it and noticing it doesn't make something bad in your life happen.
Yeah, and that it's probably actually a better long-term solution.
Right. So when I look in the closet and my husband has folded the towels and they are folded incorrectly, which is like in fourths instead of thirds, right?
Oh, you're a third Z?
I'm a third person,
I
right?
had to learn how to do that. I couldn't even figure out what's going on.
So when I notice that, instead of going and having to fix it or having to have him fix it, I take a breath. I notice that made me feel just a little anxious because things don't look quite as nice and lined up as I would like it. And then I let myself sit with it for a minute and I move on with my day. And maybe I even take an extra second to look in the closet and go, oh, those are folded differently than I would prefer. And it's going to be okay. They still dry just the same.
Sure. And you're going to pull them right out, and they're not going to be folded anyway.
That's right.
Because I tried to tell my wife, and she doesn't believe me. No, she doesn't believe me.
Hey, I appreciate you guys helping me recognize that I don't meet full-blown criteria for OCD. Thank you.
You're so welcome. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us for this episode. Hopefully something we talked about is helpful for you. Stay tuned. We've got lots of good things coming, and we'll see you on the next video.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.